Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Sorry for the delay. Um, I'm Mariah Besharov. It's wonderful to welcome you all here. I'm Professor of Organizations and Impact at the Business School at Oxford. I'm also the Academic Director of the School Center for Social Entrepreneurship, which is hosting, as we do regularly, this Insights for Action seminar. And I'm really delighted to have you all here, both those of you joining in person and also all of you joining online. So thank you and welcome. And really excited for today's seminar. We're going to be talking about a book and the issues around the book. And the book, there's lots of copies over there. It's Cities in Action. And it's Christof Brandtner's book. And it's really about an organizational perspective on city climate action. But as I think we'll see, it's much broader than that in many ways. It's about organizations, institutions, and cities' climate strategies. And the book very much sets out sort of explanation, a very powerful explanation, which Christof will unpack for us, about how and why cities engage in climate action in the way that they do. That sort of makes the argument it's really about understanding the organizational dynamics, both within cities and in the broader institutional and global context in which they operate. And we are privileged to have people joining us who work at both of those levels, Cassie and Anna. And so the three of them will be in conversation about this topic. So let me just do very brief intros and then we'll get into the discussion. And we'll spend about 40 or so minutes in conversation up here, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So Professor Christof Brandtner is Associate Professor of Social Innovation at EM Lyon Business School. And at some point, I'll separately ask you why we never capitalize EM Lyon Business School. But it's very catchy with all lowercase. He's trained in sociology and organizational and economic sociology in particular, and you'll see that come out in how he talks about the book. He, among many things that he's engaged in, really the core of his interests are around how social innovations emerge, diffuse, and are implemented in cities in particular. And in that context, he'll be talking about his work here. He's also done some work as co-founding and leading and really deeply engaging in a lab on this topic, the Civic Life of Cities Lab, which has informed a lot of the work in the book. And Christof is joined by Anna Railton. Anna is Oxford City Councillor here locally and deputy leader and cabinet member for Zero Carbon Oxford. And I hope you're going to unpack for us what Zero Carbon Oxford does. I'm just going to summarize briefly, but it's really about tackling climate and biodiversity emergencies and driving progress towards a net zero city. And really making sure that the transition is just and benefits all communities. And that's part of a wider agenda around inequality and affordable and secure housing and public services. And then we're also joined by Cassie Sutherland. Cassie is the managing director for the Climate Solutions and Networks team at C40 Cities. And likewise, we'll hear and you'll unpack in more depth what C40 Cities does. But in brief, it's a network of 100 or so global cities that are committed to halving their emissions by 2030, in addition to improving equity and resilience, clean air, jobs of high quality, and high quality of life for all residents. So I'm going to get into the conversation. Welcome to all three of you. And I want to start with Christof and the book. It's a wonderful book, really a masterpiece. And knowing the places that Christof has worked at and trained at, and I just would say it's really an exemplar of the kind of work that's possible in organizational sociology, and that really takes quite a rigorous theoretical approach. We'll spare you all the jargon in this conversation, but a really rigorous theoretical approach to understanding a really important practical problem of huge relevance to all of us. And so it's that real combination that we're going to get to zoom into today. So Christof, tell us a little bit about why you've done this work and why now, and what the central insights are from the book. And I realize, I'm asking you to summarize quite a really important and rich set of ideas. But just give us a flavor, because I've had a chance to read it, but many people here haven't yet had a chance to read it.
You have 2 hours? Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for hosting me, Mariah. Thank you also for Jessica and Mena for helping us put this on. It's such a privilege to be here. And it's especially a privilege because the protagonists of the book sitting next to me with Anna and Cassie. And so it's also a huge privilege to be able to, not only hear from you, but also have the audience learn from you as I did. I wanted to, you asked why now? And of course you have, limited control over when a book comes out. But in a way, this book is really timely. In a way that I wish it weren't. And I just wanted to start with two facts that are maybe starting us off on a low note, but then we can move on from that. The first one is that the Berkeley Earth Report came out very recently and found that the last 11 years were the hottest years in the existence of Earth. And so even though maybe some of the discourse has moved on from climate change has somehow not moved on from us. And so I hate to inform you that climate change continues to exist. At the same time, even though sometimes I think you cannot tell from looking out the window here in Oxford, but the world is getting hotter. The other fact is that at the same time, as you know, national governments, and among them the United States, have walked away from some of the multilateral treaties that are our best shot at addressing this problem effectively. And many of you will have seen that the endangerment finding in the United States was recently repealed, which basically gives license to government to legislate solutions to climate change in the first place and mitigation in particular. And so in a way these are really drastic moments. And the book basically tells the origin story of how we got to this point, because this is really not the first time that this is happening. This is the second time. In 2017, the president of the United States then, as he is now, walked into the Rose Garden of the White House and announced that his allegiance as a leader is to Pittsburgh and not to Paris. Referring to the Paris Climate Accords. And so in a way, this is the second time that we see this upsurge of national climate in action. And so what the book is about is what happened next the first time that it happened. And so what happened next is that the mayors of Paris and Pittsburgh got together and wrote a joint press release in which they said that maybe the president is out, but they're still in. And so they reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Climate Accords and to the fact that they are going to continue to uphold the 1.5-degree goal regardless. And it wasn't just them, but within a relatively short amount of time, there were almost 300 cities across the United States, as well as subnational leaders of companies, of states, who reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Climate Accords. And this also did not just happen in the United States, but the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is sort of the global cousin of this reaffirmation on the local level, has over 13,000 cities that have reaffirmed the Paris Climate Accord. So really meaningful, and this is what I mean by saying that cities have jumped into action. They sort of responded to this inaction. But the problem is, and the big puzzle of the book is that not all cities are in action, but many have actually shown inaction. So if you look at these numbers that I just shared with you, probably they are somehow between a quarter and a fifth of the number of cities that were eligible to join these commitments in the first place. So the real question is, how is it that so many cities have not joined in this collective action to do something about climate change? And this is the kind of variation that I'm hoping to to unpack and to explain. And one of the reasons we need to do this is because if we want to activate cities, then we need to understand why it is that some act and others don't act. And that is basically the premise of the book. I think this is an important question to tackle because, as many of you will know, cities are places where a lot of carbon emissions are produced. So over 70% of carbon emissions actually come from cities. I think if some cities respond to this by engaging in promising carbon emission policies or mitigation policies, then that's good. But it doesn't help if 4 surrounding cities are not doing anything. So this is really a matter of collective action. And one of the consequences of this is also that there can be high levels of inequality, both within places, because maybe not everyone within a city is acting, but also between places, between the global north and the global south, between one coast and another. And these within place inequalities are of grave concern. The last point I want to make about the significance of trying to understand this is that this is not just about climate change. Mariah already alluded to this, but it's really about building capacity to act as a city. And you saw this, for instance, in the context of COVID, where maybe the city in which you live issued a shelter-in-place policy before the state or the country in which you live did that. So in many ways, how cities are able to respond to ongoing challenges today and tomorrow, maybe it's about smartness or about AI or about, backlash against immigration or whatever we're going to face in the future is directly the result of their ability to act on behalf of the population in innovative ways. And so let me just say a couple of words briefly about, why I think that we see these stark differences. You might think that this is a story of heroic mayors that stepped up and sort of pushed back against the national governments. But the book tells a story that is different from that. It is not about heroic mayors. And when I came to realize that was when, just 2 weeks after the United States announced their withdrawal from the Paris Accords, I met with one of the sustainability planners in Washington, D.C. And, this was somebody who had literally a pencil behind his ear and who was, sitting over large plans and who, I asked him, like, how do you feel about this? And he was saying, well, I sort of, followed it. There's a lot of attention now, but, I'm really busy. I'm doing this and that and this. And, we're like in the middle of, having a green building policy. We're developing our new sustainability plan, like we're sort of busy here. And I realized that what the mayors had done at that point is not that they suddenly quickly wrote a climate action plan, but they pulled it out of the drawer because administrators in these cities had already written them and had been writing them for quite a while. So 2016-17 was not the starting point of this movement. It was a culmination of a lot of work that a lot of people had been doing by then. And so the two aspects that I think explain why some cities have been doing this work and others hadn't are, on the one hand, it's a story about, the administrative structure of the cities. One of the things I find is that actually cities that don't even have mayors are among the most proactive, but cities that have city managers tended to be much more proactive in urban sustainability initiatives. The other feature is that the kinds of initiatives that are coming from the local level, not only from local government, but also from nonprofit organizations, members of civil society, social enterprises that are engaging in experimentation around climate change are an important driving force. I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit more. The second is that this is also a question of the institutional environment that cities are embedded in and basically the context that they share with each other. And one of the things that this context has been characterized by is that there have been more and more international organizations, especially international non-governmental organizations over the last 2 decades that explicitly deal with local and city level initiatives. And among those are very influential, powerful organizations, among them organizations like ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, the 100 Resilient Cities Network, and C40, an organization that Cassie represents and that you're going to hear from more as well. And these organizations are powerful because they have enabled a lot of learning among cities that means that you do not need to invent new solutions to climate change locally. You can actually see how other cities solve them and respond to those and learn from those. And these kinds of learning networks that I'm sure you will in turn learn about today, incredibly interesting. And one of the just want to share like one thing that I found fascinating in learning about them, which is that a lot of the city managers and urban sustainability officers that I interviewed for this book mentioned that the city-to-city interactions that that these networks enabled for them were really, really important because it allowed them to learn from each other. And so you might think that the reason that what other cities are doing is a matter of competition, right? So for instance, I learned that the chief resilience officer of New York told me that this response to the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords wasn't spontaneous, but in fact, it had already been telegraphed that this was going to happen. And the chief sustainability officers had been on the phone with each other for weeks planning their response. And so the benefit that the chief resilience officer of New York had over the chief resilience or sustainability officer of Los Angeles was 3 hours. And so the poor chief sustainability officer of Los Angeles had to set his alarm clock at 5 in the morning so he could send the press release out before his colleague in New York. So there was a lot of competition for trying to be the first to respond. So clearly there are some political dynamics. But when I spoke to some of their colleagues, specifically a chief sustainability officer in Chicago, what he told me is that he loves to read these documents and these plans and releases of other cities because they're trying to figure out, basically what these other cities are doing. And they do that because they're trying to steal their ideas. Sounds very competitive. But they also says we want to steal them because we want to learn from these other cities. And so it's a matter of collaboration and collaboration through these networks. Okay, so in other words, what the book is showing that cities are doing more for climate change or are engaging in climate action when they have an Anna and when they have a Cassie, and when Anna can meet Cassie. And so meet Anna and Cassie, I guess.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to turn to Anna and Cassie. And so I want to ask you, I'm going to say one more elaboration from the book and then ask you this question, because one of the things that I picked up, which is sort of like a level down in the nuance of the argument, but not too in the weeds, I hope, is the notion that like there are different aspects and they're sort of sequential, not completely, in sort of how cities engage in climate action. And they sort of map to your chapters, right? So, and one of the messages is sort of the planning and the learning, the key stuff that the Cassies of the world are doing is important there. And when we get to more of what you call the leading and the scaling, the stuff that the Annas of the world are doing is really important. I know it's not that simple, right? But the sort of like beginning stages, and then there's more of the sort of the execution operation and really like roll it out and let's really do that. And so what that says to me is like there is this important interaction between the global networks where there's learning, but also competition, and the local organizational capacity where there's the deep knowledge that's been built and the action potential and the scaling potential. So with that in mind, Anna, I'm going to start with you and tell us just a little bit first about your work here in Oxford and then how that work resonates with the kinds of ideas that Christof has talked about in the book.
How's that? There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I guess the sort of, when it comes to climate resilience, the two sort of big problems that Oxford is going to have, one is heat and sort of basically, people overheating in their homes. And the second one is flooding, which, I think we may have just got away with it, actually. Hopefully, fingers crossed. But I guess sort of on the ground, what the city council can do, sort of lots of things around, yes, how you do sort of planning for new buildings and what you do with the old buildings, putting in EV infrastructure, air quality type stuff, and that's where, yes, it's very helpful to be able to essentially pinch ideas from other cities. So certainly when it comes to stuff like local plans, these are things that take are really, really impactful because they affect every single bit of new development in the city, and they take years to do. But it's really helpful to sort of look at what Cornwall did or whatever and see, okay, they managed to push the envelope in this sort of environmental policy. We'll basically go and scoop that up and stick that in ours. Because, you don't want to, there's always a bit of a balancing act. You don't want to put in stuff that's like so out there that it gets to inspection, they throw it out. But you also don't want to just be too conservative and then sort of not move anything forward. And then sort of, I guess, when it comes to communicating stuff with residents and sort of not getting loads of pushback. I think one of the key things I guess I've learned from sort of bitter experience. So I've got a background in like I'm a mathematician, so sort of love the data. What I've learned is that your average resident is not convinced by data. They unfortunately, they're really not. Sort of talking about carbon emissions, basically nobody is turned on by that at all. Actually, it's too abstract. People do not know what tons of carbon actually even mean. They've got no way of really visualizing it or what it means to their lives. The thing that convinces people that things are a good idea is stories. Really, it's sort of telling the story about how doing X, Y, Z will make their lives better. It's not about saying, oh, this will reduce this, amount of carbon or something. This does not convince the average voter on the doorstep in Oxford. I can probably count on my hands the number of times that's ever come up when I've talked to people. But yeah, it's what affects their sort of day-to-day lives, what makes things better for people, and that's how you sort of want to get things done. So, when it comes to, so I'm really interested in stuff that scales. I'm less interested in sort of the big kind of like one-off project, like decarbonising the town hall or whatever. I'm much more interested in the stuff that scales across, every single sort of homeowner or whatever, every single tenant in the city, and sort of making it easy as possible for them to do the right thing, to sort of, if they want to retrofit their house, how can you make that? How can you remove some of the many, many sources of friction in that? So I think, that's sort of where I've ended up. But I guess we can unpick some details later.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we'll come back to some of those. Cassie, just to ask you to start by just unpacking a little bit more C40, the mission, what you all do, and then to share a little bit about, again, how the core ideas from the book resonate with that work.
Yeah, sure. And thanks very much for having me today. So I'm from C40 Cities, which is a network of nearly 100 cities around the world, despite the name. At some point, we had 40 cities. And then we decided, let's not keep doing the logo over and over again when we get more cities. We'll focus on climate action instead. So we kept the name for a bit, and we're now nearly 100 cities. So that's got over that problem first. But beyond that, our job is really to help cities steal ideas from each other. That is definitely my job, right? Is to try and say, around the world, how does any city pre-fill the start of their local plan, the start of their building retrofit program, the start of their urban nature initiative, by taking that information from another city and taking not only the information about what's in there, but also what worked and what didn't. And that's definitely at the essence of C40. The other half of the plan needs to be filled in by people like Anna, right? Who know the local context, who know the people who live in the houses of Oxford, and can understand how the city works. But how can she get half of the way there? So that's definitely kind of our job. And so C40 was started 20 years ago by the then Mayor of London with exactly that premise. So there being all of these cities who are wanting to drive forward climate action, but weren't learning from each other. And that learning wasn't happening at a national level. And it doesn't happen at a national level because geopolitics is complicated, as we know, and we could have a whole other 2 hours on that. But while there is some healthy competition between cities, you don't have this same kind of tension often between cities that you maybe do have at a national government level. And that allows that kind of sharing of ideas to happen a bit quicker. The healthy competition, when you're a city official, is great. You play into it. I used to work for the Mayor of London and working on environment policy. And if Paris had implemented something, it really helped convince people in London to implement it because there was a bit of healthy competition. That's okay. You can kind of play into that. And, mayors and politicians play into that. But I think that's a level that's beyond the kind of, challenges or conflicts between. So, and I think what we've done at C40, so it is really a peer-to-peer sharing network, but it's a high ambition network. So I talk about C40 as being unashamedly ambitious. These mayors have signed up to a high level of climate standards by joining the network. And in fact, we don't charge any fees for cities to join the network. Each year, they have to meet a set of leadership standards. So they have to have a climate action plan. They have to be implementing some actions. They have to talk about climate. They have to engage with the public. And if year on year, if a city doesn't meet those standards, then they're asked to leave C40. So it maintains, therefore, as a leadership network. And while we haven't lost a lot of cities, we have lost some, where the politicians have changed, where the new mayor has come in, and there's been less, real kind of ambition around climate. And I think that's important because the nearly 100 cities in the C40 network represent around 700 million residents worldwide, about 25% of the world's GDP. So the theory is, if you make a difference across those cities, you have made a global impact in and of itself. You halve emissions in those cities. For example, you improve livelihoods, there's a global impact. But also there should be a ripple effect from any leadership group. So that action should inspire actions of smaller cities, of cities that have less resources, of also other level of governments, such as national governments. And I think that's also a responsibility of some of the largest cities around the world that are able to do that. And then maybe just to end on, pick up on Anna's point of what works, right, to convince residents. I agree. It's stories, isn't it? It's kind of that stories. It's never your tons of carbon. I've worked in climate for a long time. Can I really explain a ton of carbon and why do I care about it, right? And then a megaton and so on. But how can you track? It's a helpful tracker for some people. That's okay. But for people who live in the city, it's really about that kind of interaction in their day-to-day life. And you mentioned heat briefly here as an issue in Oxford. I was recently in the city of Freetown in Sierra Leone, who have a really ambitious mayor on climate, Yvonne Akisoye. If you can ever hear her speak, please do. She's very inspiring. But she's done a big project of providing shading infrastructure over the markets in Freetown. There's something like 75 outdoor markets in Freetown. It really is kind of underpinning the economy and the well-running of the city, all of the market workers. The majority of those market workers are women, and they rely heavily on the kind of income that they're getting from the market. The problem with heat is it's really, as it gets more and more extreme in the city, it's really hard to stay out and work in the heat. I think we can all expect that. But when I was in Freetown, the thing that surprised me talking to a market worker was they said, oh, the shading is great because it's allowed us to rebuild the trust between us and our customers. So the problem with heat was it was spoiling the goods. The fruit, the vegetables, the meat was going off quicker. And therefore, the customers were saying, well, you're selling us rubbish here. This is not good stuff. What's happened to your produce? You're no longer a trusted seller. And that for them was even more important than their own kind of health and well-being and being able to stay on a market stall for longer or not. So suddenly you've got a whole other dimension about trust and the needs that, a city working as a system relies a lot on trust between people who are interacting. And so while that's maybe a few miles from Oxford, I thought it was maybe an interesting example to bring that story.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's great. And so I want to pick up on that because that's sort of a great and somewhat of an unanticipated success, right? But I want to go back to where you started with that, which is the challenges, right? And so, Anna, you were talking about the challenge of numbers don't convince. How do I get people to really be on board in the role of stories? And I just wanted to ask you how you have grappled with that one a little bit, and what are some of the other things that sort of are the roadblocks that have come up in your work and how you've grappled with them.
Okay, yeah, I've got some fun examples of this because people love hearing stories of fuck ups, right? So, I guess the first thing I would talk about is verges. So, if any of you were here, if any of you lived in Oxford about 3 years ago, you'll remember that at some point we stopped cutting all of the verges. This might not sound like a big deal, but essentially the story is, okay, so there's two tiers of local government. In Oxford, there is a county council who deal with the highways, and there's the city council that has sort of some stuff that the county gets them to do, but they deal with a different set of stuff. Anyway, so the county council is slightly more broke than city council. So at some point, I think in sort of 2022, 2023, I forget now, they decided, okay, we're spending loads of money on cutting all of the verges in all of the county, 6 times a year. We're going to just do one because that will save multiple millions of pounds, genuinely millions of pounds. And so they told all the sort of 5 districts below that, oh yeah, by the way, we're only going to pay you one for one cut. Anyway, so we in Oxford were like, okay. So we've had a trial before where we had some sort of nice biodiversity verges where we sort of did, cut and collect, and you get wildflowers and all of this kind of stuff. So we basically, I am basically very much partially kind of to blame for this. We sort of decided to lean in and we're like, okay, we'll kind of roll with this. We don't have the money. We actually didn't have the money to go back to the original, pay the sort of £1 million it's going to cost to cut everything 6 times a year. So we're like, okay, we'll lean in. We'll say, we're not cutting the verges for, to get increase in biodiversity in the city, which is sort of true, but it was mostly because we didn't have the money to do it. Anyway, so it was a really sort of hot and wet year. So the grass grew Like it was wild. So some people loved it. I personally did love it, actually. The problem is the people who loved it tended to live in the places where there weren't any verges, and the people who absolutely hated it were all in the sort of estates around the side of the city that were built in the 70s with these massive, great big verges. So anyway, there were thousands and thousands of complaints, it was an absolute sort of PR disaster, of which I am very largely to blame. And I think it's a good story about how actually very much do not try and sell cost savings as climate measures. Like, really bad idea. So anyway, we now cut them slightly more, and we have learned from our mistakes on that one. It was about listening. We did just have to listen to people and sort of reverse this. So the other sort of like really difficult thing is, okay, so we're very fortunate in Oxford. We've still basically got most of our council housing left. We've sort of got about 8,000 council houses. Basically all of these are heated by gas, as you would expect. It'd be really good if we could start electrifying, the heat in all of these places. This has turned out to be unbelievably difficult sell for people, because if you are average council tenant in a council house in Oxford, what you are asking people to do is, one, have loads of like faffy work taking place in their home that they didn't necessarily sign up for. Two, you're expecting them to change their behavior quite substantially. Living with a heat pump is quite different to living with a gas boiler. And third, and most crucially, you cannot guarantee that their bills are going to be cheaper. So you basically have it's more or less a complete non-starter, unless they tend to already have a sort of really expensive, direct electric heating system. So that has been very, very difficult. And I think, I can count on the number of council houses we've sort of willingly, we've converted over. The new builds are slightly different, and that's much easier. But retrofitting the old stuff, intensely difficult.
Okay, thank you. And those are great examples, and they link to the next topic I want to get into a little bit, which is like, on the one hand, they're so rooted locally in this the first one in particular, right? And there's the specifics of Oxford and the geography here and the, which communities are living where and so on. And at the other hand, like, they're surely not totally unique, right? And this question of, sort of how do we think about not just the common challenges, but the common approaches for dealing with them, and sort of what can be learned from the Oxford plus all the other, whether it's the 100 in C40 or the thousands that you studied in your book, where there's opportunities to sort of learn from how other cities have overcome these challenges. So I want to put that to you first, Cassie, and ask if there are some common challenges that either resonate with what Anna said or others, but in particular, how C40 has seen that group as a way to do some collective learning, as Christof has talked about in the book.
Yeah, thanks very much. They're fantastic examples from Anna, and because I agree that everybody loves to hear when things have gone wrong, but I also think as a city policy official, it's a lonely job if things are going wrong as well. And so what we try and do at C40 is provide a bit of a safe space for cities around the world to share when things are going wrong as well. So we have kind of these peer-to-peer sharing networks where it's people who do the same job in different cities around the world. So maybe you're the waste manager for Bogota, Barcelona, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, and London, and 30 other cities, and you're coming together to share your challenges. Maybe you're all trying to increase biodiversity in the city, and you're all kind of managing the urban nature. So I think providing that safe space is really important, and those cities knowing that they can trust the other city officials won't leak something. I think the challenge of working in a city is it's this highly political environment. It's very visible. You'll know this better than I do, but it's so those, you talked about the thousands of complaints. I bet there was local news articles about their verges not being cut, and and that was like your life for 14 hours a day for however many months. So I think we're trying to find some of that space so that also city officials can come up with the innovative solutions to that, how to manage that or how to avoid that. And I think one of the ways that we've learned and seen in cities to be able to overcome some of these challenges, because you're right, these are happening across the world, is looking at different entry points for this climate action. So what is another driver? So Anna said, not a good idea to try and say, let's lead into biodiversity when your problem was budget cuts. But, and the challenge around electrification. But we've done a lot of research on where is the biggest opportunity for job creation. Retrofit of homes is the biggest opportunity for local job creation. Therefore, should building retrofit be the program that is going to solve unemployment in some cities? Yes, it could be one of the key programs that is going to solve unemployment. Yes, you've still got challenges around entering people's homes, multiple visits, but you're starting from a point of view of tackling an issue that many people in the city care about, much more than, to be honest, am I going to save £2.50 on my bill or not by the end of this? So looking, I think, at job creation as an entry point, it's in your book as well, but I'll steal this example now of in Bogota, where they have electrified the bus fleet. And they have the biggest electric bus fleet in any city outside of China, which is kind of interesting. So if you're in Bogota, any bus you're on will be an electric bus. But in order to also increase the public acceptance of this kind of change, which did cost more money from the budget, they partnered this with a huge program around training female drivers in Bogota, where they really had high levels of unemployment in women in the city, and particularly in the transport sector. It was given a name, La Rolita. It was a whole program. It was advertised well. It was marketed well. And it really had then a lot of uptake. What was interesting was it went wrong after a year because some of the women were saying, I can't do this. Yeah, this is great to have this job, but it doesn't give me enough flexibility. And my kid is sick. I need to go and pick my kid up. What do I do from school? Or I need to go and do childcare. So then the city said, oh, okay. So then they implemented another part of that program that provided additional service support for those women, and said, here's some other support like flexibility of your contract and working hours, support for childcare, for healthcare, so that you could also keep people in employment. So I think that's coming from a very different perspective than we're trying to get rid of diesel and we're trying to replace it with electric around that transport system. So this kind of holistic approach and engaging with the people that are being affected by that, we found to work well. Could Bogota have engaged with those women about those job contracts at the start? Yes. You know, it was a mistake they made first, but then they kind of corrected it and adapted it. And I think that's an important learning. And they learned from other cities to be able to do that. So that's the kind of approach that we're looking at. I think some of those entry points are health, are job creation, are safety. Seeing a lot of work now around school streets, so trying to restrict cars around schools for, during commuters' time. This is, of course, an environment measure to improve air quality, but also it's a road safety measure. Do you want a really busy road as your kids are kind of going to school? So I think starting to see some of these and worrying about the kind of the climate bit, of course, still talking about it, but it coming afterwards.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Christof, I want to go back to you on this in two ways. So one, as you talk in the book about you're focusing on climate, but really this is an example, not to trivialize it, like it's a super important thing in itself. And there's so much to learn about other spaces of innovation and social impact where sort of the model of sort of what explains why some cities are doing a lot and others are not can apply. And so maybe to reflect a little bit in that context on what Cassie's just said about how there's really they're not even just issues where the same explanation applies, but they're interconnected issues and interconnected opportunities for innovation. But then also to reflect on sort of this link between the local and the global, right? And so, because what Cassie's talking about is sort of the role of the global in helping not just individual cities with those local challenges, but then sharing the learnings in, say, the network like the C40 or others, and how that can really help with this issue of scaling the solutions, not just sharing the learnings or scaling the learnings about the challenges.
These are both great questions. I'm going to take them one at a time. So the first one that I think is very important to me as a takeaway from the book is that we should not understand urban sustainability as a standalone issue or climate action as a standalone issue, but we should really try to understand the kinds of organizational processes that allow cities to engage in urban innovation, whatever they may be, whatever the sort of the current challenges may be. And I think that the kinds of networks that Cassie was just describing are crucial, and they extend over many different areas. So just to give you a couple of examples of that process, many of the cities have mentioned in conversation and in their plans who their peer cities are. And so they actually list a number of cities that they regularly look to, that they want to steal from because they consider them cities that they learn from, like, and there's a variety of different ones, like, but Copenhagen, talks about Barcelona and Vancouver and San Francisco and Sydney. And so you have, sometimes really these important connections. Sometimes they don't go as horizontal. So for instance, the mayor of a small town on the west coast of the United States, like under 100,000 people, says that before he talks to anyone else in the government of the United States, in the county, in the state, on the national stage, he picks up the phone and he calls the mayor of Barcelona, because they are likely to have a better answer to the issue that they're challenged, that this city manager is facing than their direct colleagues. And I have no idea if the mayor of Barcelona routinely picks up the phone, but it was still interesting to see that they think about this. And what became clear in talking to urban sustainability managers about how they use these networks is that they're not just about taking the best practices from C40 or 100RC, but it was also about the kinds of personal networks that they forged through these opportunities. So actually a lot of the sustainability officers apparently are on a group chat with each other. So they have like a WhatsApp channel where they, some are telling me like, oh, if I don't know the answer to this, I just, write a text message to my colleagues and somebody will have already solved this. It's not just about solving it. It's also about, as Cassie was saying, that sometimes this can be very lonely work and very isolating work. And, we've been mentioning a lot of examples of cities like Copenhagen and, New York and so on. But in the book, there's also a section where we spoke to cities in political contexts, or people, representatives of cities in political contexts that were much less hospitable to this kind of work, and where urban sustainability officers were really alone in this effort, where they were, felt like they were siloed and they were detached from what was going on in the city more broadly. And so this kind of safe space that Cassie was mentioning, of being able to be together with others who are facing similar issues, is really crucial. And it is especially crucial for this question of how to frame your problems in a way that is convincing, that Anna mentioned, right? So not only to explain why climate change is important, but also why these issues have co-benefits, for instance. And some of these formulations are also, the green jobs thing is an important one, but just to give you one more example that came from someone at the Pentagon, actually, they had to make a case for why you should have energy efficient buildings. And they realized that the base is that, we're bringing in gasoline from elsewhere in order to run their generators, like energy inefficient, but also expose the soldiers to tremendous dangers, because they actually had now to go out there and bring the gasoline back. If you minimize the number of these trips, you minimize, the threat to the lives of these individuals. And so they were able to make a case that this is basically a matter of personal safety and also of national safety to become electrified and to sort of rethink how you run your base. So I think these kinds of learning networks have permanent benefits that are not just specific to climate change, but here work really well in trying to explain what you do. The second question that I wanted to get into was, you asked about the connections between local and global, but it's important to go back a little bit to these interactions that Anna mentioned, and the fact that they are not always generative. So a lot of these local initiatives, you've seen this, those of you who live in Oxford, I think locally, sometimes lead to political backlash. So for instance, Carlos Moreno, who came up with the idea of the 15-minute cities, if I understand correctly, when he came to Oxford to give a talk a couple of years ago, needed a personal security detail because he received death threats. The Agenda 21, which is, one of the early initiatives to have participatory decision-making that came out of a United Nations meeting, is often criticized by really conspiracy theorists as something that shapes or constrains the individual freedoms of people, because, you're locked into your neighborhoods, and, some kind of global cabal tries to, control local initiatives. And, think about this what you want, but the important thing is that these local reactions are not always positive. There is backlash. However, in the book, I found that in many cases, having a proactive civil society and what I call civic capacity, so basically the ability of cities to have nonprofit social enterprises, just really value-driven organizations that care about social and environmental problems and try to solve them, and to the extent to which they have them more than you would expect from the place, is a very important driver of green initiatives. And the important, where I think this underscores most cleanly, if we still have time for another example, their important role is in the context of green buildings. So that's something that I studied in quite some detail, specifically in the context of the United States. And I was looking at why some cities were faster and sort of more expansive in adopting green building certifications, LEED certifications in particular. Here in the UK, it's more like BREEAM is a more common framework, but these certifications basically just list out what you need to do as a building or as a building owner in order to make a building energy efficient and sort of green and also livable. And there are many things you can do: proximity to public transportation, and the kind of air conditioning systems that you have, and the materials you use, and many others. And many times, the way that we think about these kinds of initiatives is often that the kind of government policies that circulate among cities are what's driving them. And what I found is that that's not always the case. In fact, in many cities, what's driving the uptake of green buildings is that nonprofit organizations that care deeply about the environment were among the very first organizations to take them up. And it was often their sort of demonstration projects. So basically the early wins that they were able to show by, for instance, having a beautiful library that is, lives up to these standards, is what established this as something that other organizations saw as something that can work. And in many places, local governments actually then learned from that and initiated policies that would, convince others to do the same thing. So in brief, the important takeaway from this is that sort of we know that state capacity and market capacity are very important, but sort of the third key to the city that really makes cities able to better engage in these kinds of practices come from the bottom up, and that is these forms of civic capacity.
Okay, thank you. And I'm aware that we're getting short on time, and we're going to come to questions in a minute, but I want to pose one last question to Cassie and Anna, which is really, so we've talked a lot about the sort of organizational perspective on cities and the role of the global connections and networks, and the sort of what we in academia would call sort of the institutional layer, right, beyond the local, but then also the organizational capacity locally within cities. And as Christof has just highlighted, including and especially the sort of civil society, social enterprise, nonprofit capacity and drive. And one thing we haven't talked about is leadership. Although you did say that mayors are not that important at the beginning. And so that's not what, I'm not going to bring us back to that directly, but I do, obviously, individuals are animating organizations, right? And you all in particular are sort of working in these spaces. And so I just want to invite you to reflect on recognizing and not diminishing at all the importance of this organizational lens on understanding variation in how and in what ways and to what extent cities take action on climate and other issues. What have you learned and observed about the most important practices for the individual leaders populating these organizations and doing that work? And I say leaders meaning leadership at all levels of the organization, not just at the top.
Well, I should go first.
This should be a whole nother seminar, I realize.
I should go first, only to say, I have to say mayors can be leaders. I mean, otherwise I'm well out of a job, Christof, if I don't say that mayors can truly be leaders. But kind of jokes aside, I mean, I think it is interesting in the climate space, but also in other topics, where mayors around the world are really using their leadership voice and power. And I often talk about cities using their direct powers or hard powers, and then their indirect powers or soft powers. And the indirect and soft powers of cities being as strong sometimes as the hard and direct ones. So your hard powers are things like your planning powers, or maybe your ability to cut the verges, your kind of your day-to-day systems, your waste systems, and so on. The soft powers are the convening power, the leadership power, the ability to influence of a city. And I think mayors can be particularly strong here because they can bring together a coalition of actors to make a bigger change that's beyond the jurisdiction of that particular city. So in fact, at the moment, we're doing quite a lot of work with the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, because they're seeing across Greater Melbourne challenges around data centres taking up lots of different land around the city, and kind of land that had been safeguarded for housing before and is now kind of a drain on some of the water and energy. And we're working on how to manage that challenge. The Lord Mayor of Melbourne is only formally responsible for the central business district of the city, but is taking a wider leadership role across all of the kind of, I think there's 30 odd wards and boroughs across the city, because he is able to bring together a coalition of people there. So I think that's a kind of, that leadership is important as well, about when you go outside of your boundary. But I would also say I very much agree with Christof about leadership at different levels in cities, and that, you know, policy needs politics and politics needs policy. And so you need your civil servants, your local government officials who are going to work in a city for 20 years. Maybe they've seen 4 or 5 mayors who are going to keep pushing on building the evidence base, designing the policy, having it ready, so that when the politician comes in and prioritizes that, they say, they get it out the drawer and they say, great, this is a great piece of work, it's evidence-based, I can move straight away. Because you've got to have that kind of, you know, robust and credible work behind. And so at C40, what we try and do is we are a network of city officials and a network of mayors. And so trying to maintain those relationships between mayors who also need each other, need to be able to phone and WhatsApp each other and build confidence to take climate action, and bold, ambitious climate action. That takes political will and risk, you know, and kind of comes with risks. But also you need to support those people who are trying to really develop the policy and how they can do that over time. So I think you need both.
Okay, thank you. And I would say the way you characterize leadership, it's very much, and we talk a lot about this at the center, a sort of orchestrating, facilitating, enabling view, right? It's not the heroic leader out in front. And so in a way, it's a very organizational perspective on leadership. Anna.
So I think, yeah, I will also echo the sort of convening power thing and how important that is. I mean, yeah, lots of politics is genuinely about sort of relationship building and knowing how to get the best out of people. And I think, yeah, certainly, I mean, Oxford is great because it is absolutely like rammed full of people who are like super engaged, who, you know, are pretty smart, know how to get things done and want to get things done. And actually, so, you know, so the city has only got so much like actual operational power, but it is generally a really good sort of convener of, you know, the institutions, you know, the hospitals, the colleges, the 2 universities, you know, the big employers, and, you know, bringing them all together to sort of tackle the problems which affect all of them. So, you know, for example, we have a zero carbon Oxford partnership. It contains exactly that set of people. And one of the sort of things it's been tackling, you know, recently, there's a really good, thriving, like sustainable commuting group, right? Because, you know, transport, big issue in Oxford. And of course, all of the employers are sitting there being like, okay, we've got all these like transport measures coming down, and we know loads of our staff live outside the city. We don't, you know, how are we going to ensure they all get to work safely? And you know, don't just leave and go and get a job elsewhere. You know, huge problem for the hospitals, for example. You know, barely any of the nurses in Oxford can afford to live in Oxford. So you know, they, you know, OUH, you know, the hospitals do not want to lose their nurses to BIST or whatever, because they cannot afford, or it's too difficult for their nurses to get into the city. So, you know, that's a really good example of, you know, a group of institutions coming together with actually fairly similar set of problems in the end, and sort of basically making it easier for everybody to sort of just unpick and get to the bottom of things. So yes, I think, yeah, convening power, yeah, building relationships and just sort of making things, just kind of just trying to remove friction from people and making things work is generally, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to turn to some questions. I'm going to just collect a few from the room and then put it over to you to pick maybe 2 or 3 to respond to. So any questions, reactions from those of you here in the room? Yep. We're going to pass the mic around.
Thank you very much for having me in this seminar and ask the questions. And I'm a PhD student from Warwick Business School doing research on sustainability ecosystem and hybrid organizations. So my question is, we know the climate change is a wiki problem, engage the aspects like climate adaptation and also the mitigation. And it involves so many different organizations, even in building the resilient cities, like the city councils, the municipal governments, and also business, nonprofits. So what do you think of, there might be some institutional paradox, like between the short-term and the long-term benefits and different issues in sustainability? What might be the more severe paradoxes are facing the inter-organizational coordination or interaction? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So you've invited us to think about coordination, collaboration, thinking about climate as sort of a wicked problem, if you will. Any other questions? And then we'll take.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk and for a fantastic book. I just got it, and like was looking through the pages, there's so many things like to learn. And thank you very much for bringing the experience from Oxfordshire. And the question, I'm a research fellow at the law faculty here in the University of Oxford, and initially the associate professor for environmental law in Ukraine. And we have been cooperating with a number of institutions working on the Build Ukraine Back Better like principle. And we were exactly trying to leverage the cooperation between cities, like, and trying to have these city-to-city partnerships that would enable Ukraine's green and sustainable reconstruction and recovery. So from your experiences, like, and we do treat this very optimistically because we see where the distraction comes there, the opportunity for leapfrogging comes as well. So from your perspective, what lessons or what kind of hopeful messages from what you have researched, what you have seen, like either from the historical perspective or day to day, like Ukraine cities can get and can learn from? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more.
Thank you all for your presentation. I cannot wait to read the book. My name is Dewey. I'm a master's student at UCL's the Bartlett Development Planning Unit doing environment and sustainable development. And I'm really keen to find out among the three of you or just one of you, if you have any comments or any good examples of how municipal finance have really been used towards transformative sustainable development planning. And I'm thinking more as well on like context that could be applied in the global south, particularly because a lot of the resilience issues that we have globally, I mean, of course, global north and global south face similar issues, but more so compounding in terms of vulnerabilities in the global south. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So back over to you all. There's a question about the sort of the interorganizational dynamics when we think about climate as a wicked problem and also the short-term, long-term aspects of that. Lessons for recovery in Ukraine and cities and the role of cities in that context from the work that you all are doing. And then the question of municipal finance for sustainable development planning, and especially in the global south. So we're not going to tackle all of them in our overtime few minutes, but if there's anywhere you see energy and want to jump in, I'll turn it over to you.
Wicked problem framing, and like in other words, what is a particularly challenging trade-off in the context of city climate action? And what sort of immediately came to mind for me is the fact that a lot of this seems to be driven by voluntary uptake. Nobody forces cities to do any of these things. Nobody forces, the Oxford Said Business School to build a beautiful building that also has, photovoltaic panels on the roof and a green building, and a green roof. So basically, voluntary uptake is inherently skewed, because many organizations are going to opt out of doing expensive things, politically difficult things, and that leads to inequalities. That leads to the fact that not everybody participates. I think one of the biggest challenges is how to extend this initiative, this motivation, this movement that we see among some places to places that do not have access to them, and that may well be Ukrainian cities, and it may be cities in the global south. I think one of the most important things about this is to both, take seriously that this is not the only way to bring about change, but it is something that we do while we're waiting for, drastic national and global policies that are going to address these issues. So it's complementary and not a replacement for it, and not compensatory. And I think, essentially, it's important to keep pushing on this front as well. And you have mentioned that cities often also play a role in this. And I think that a lot of the foundations and networks that reach out to some cities and support them also have to broaden the scope by which they deliver their successes. I think C40 has done this very well, ICLEI as well, but I think especially organizations that require selecting into the organization need to take the risk of randomly assigning support to cities that otherwise would never be able to win a grant or participate in these kinds of networks.
Thank you.
I can have a go at the municipal finance question. So, it's a really important one as well. And of course, particularly for any financing for climate resilience adaptation measures that require this kind of high upfront cost and don't have necessarily a direct return on investment. It's about avoiding losses. So that's definitely a challenge. And for many cities, but particularly global south cities that are on the front line of climate impacts. We've been supporting a number of cities to implement climate budgeting within their kind of governance systems. And this is basically integrating climate into every decision that's made on a government, a city kind of finance sheet. So assigning a kind of climate benefit to that. It started in Oslo and led to some quite big changes, not only within the city departments itself, but then also kind of starting to develop new industries as well within the city. For example, now they're pretty much electric construction machinery all over Oslo because of this kind of initiative, but is now starting to be adapted and adopted by much bigger cities and some global south cities. Mumbai recently released their climate budget. So, and what it does is kind of then leverage the municipal finance you have. When those budgets are small, it can also attract better finance into the city. So, for example, from World Bank or multilateral development banks, and being able to say, okay, this is the business case for this. So I think that kind of climate budgeting is an approach that we're really seeing that could also lead to scale. Quickly on the kind of lessons and hopeful messages for collaboration around cities, what I've seen in my experience of working at C40 is while this network is built around climate, it can also then work for other things. So when COVID-19 hit, we basically pivoted as an organization to also be a network of mayors that were supporting each other through a COVID pandemic. And so cities around the world, these mayors were sharing PPE, for example, because they knew each other through C40, even though maybe they're from totally different political persuasions, but this, they've been brought together on climate and they were brought together on this. So I think I would say that, particularly for the example in Ukraine, kind of using existing city networks to then really kind of adapt to the latest need because, and what we've all talked about a lot, because that relationship part is very important and is long lasting. Right? Once you build up that kind of trust and credibility within cities, it can therefore be kind of used for multiple outcomes.
I can give a local example of quite a good local example of municipal finance working to kind of just get the market going. So this is in the sphere of EV charging. So, we obviously would like more cars to be electrified, but the sort of infrastructure needs to be sort of, sufficiently good first before you'll get sort of big movements. So you end up with this kind of chicken and egg problem. And certainly, places in the city where, if you stick an EV charger in the ground, it will make money and that's fine. But you don't want to end up in a situation where, you've got loads up in North Oxford because the market will just sort it out. But, the person who's driving a DPD electric van who lives in Blackbird Leys has to walk for half an hour to plug his van in. So, you don't want to end up in that situation. So there was a tranche of public money that essentially is trying to address that problem. It means we get an actual decent and equitable, spread of stuff over the city. The supercharger down at Redbridge Park and Ride is another really good example of a public-private partnership model, which did generally get something in the ground that's really useful for people, and now charges tens of thousands of cars per year. So I think that's a really good example where it actually has worked.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank all of you, Christof, Anna, and Cassie, for a really wonderful discussion. And Christof, thank you for doing the book. Fantastic book. Thank you all for joining in person and online. For those of you here in Oxford, we hope you can stay and join us for a reception here in the Nest. And also, please do feel free to pick up a copy of Christof's book. Thank you again.